All right, this morning we're continuing with the human body, which we started yesterday, and we stopped at the circulatory system. Yesterday we looked at the composition of the blood and the layout of the blood vessels. So today we're going to look at the heart specifically and the movement of blood within the circulatory system. The circulatory system anatomy. It's a complex arrangement of connected tubes, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. It has two circuits. You have the systemic circulation, which is the circulation of blood to and from the body. So that's what the systemic circulation is. It's the circulation of blood from the heart to the body and blood returning from the body to the heart. The pulmonary circulation is the circulation of blood from the heart to the lungs, and then the blood is returned from the lungs to the heart. With that understanding, it means that the systemic circulation starts from the left ventricle and it ends at the right atrium. And the pulmonary circulation starts at the right ventricle and ends at the left atrium. Now let's look at the heart, and we're gonna have to zoom in on your side. So the heart. Excuse me. Right, so let's look at the heart before we go any further. So the heart is a muscle. It is a muscle, so it is referred to as the myocardium. The size of an individual's heart is the size of their fist. So your heart is the size of your fist. It is larger in males than in females. And the main role, function of the heart is to receive and distribute blood. That's it. So it is responsible for receiving blood and distributing blood. Now, the heart has 4 chambers. So it has 4 chambers, and 2 upper chambers, 2 lower chambers. The upper chambers are referred to as atriums. The lower chambers are referred to as ventricles. So you have a right atrium and a left atrium, and you have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. So that's the 4 chambers of the heart. The left ventricle is the largest chamber of the heart because it does the most work, and this would be the left ventricle. So it's the largest chamber because it does the most work, and because it's the chamber that does the most work, it is the chamber that is prone to damage from a heart attack. So most heart attack will damage that side of the heart. Doesn't mean that it's the only side that can be affected by a heart attack, but commonly it's gonna be the left ventricle. Now, one side of the heart is responsible for receiving and distributing deoxygenated blood, and the other side of the heart is responsible for receiving and distributing oxygenated blood. Now, because one side is moving the oxygenated blood and the other side is moving oxygenated blood, the blood cannot mix. So the right side that is transporting blood cannot have that blood mixing with the left side. So within the heart, there is a wall. There's a wall that separates the right side of the heart from the left side of the heart so that the blood does not mix. The deoxygenated blood doesn't mix with the oxygenated blood. And this wall is referred to as the septum of the heart. Now, within the heart and outside of the heart, there are valves. So you have valves within the heart, and you have valves outside of the heart. So you have a valve on the right side of the heart, a valve on the left side, and there's a valve in the pulmonary artery and a valve in the aorta. Now, the purpose of these valves within the heart and outside of the heart is to prevent blood from flowing in the wrong direction. So it prevents the backflow of blood, right? So on the right, it's try right, by or my left. So on the right side of the heart, you have the tricuspid valve. Try right, by or my left. On the left side, you have the bicuspid or mitral valve. And within the pulmonary artery, you have the pulmonic valve, and in the aorta, you have the aortic valve. Now, when these valves open and close, that is what gives us the heartbeat. So when we are listening to a patient's heart beating, we're listening to the valves open and close. That's what you're hearing. So that's the heart muscle. Now, just like the lungs, the heart has a membrane around it. And that membrane has an inner lining that is directly attached to the heart muscle itself. And it has an outer lining that is attached to the cavity. The membrane is referred to as the pericardial sac, right? So that's the pericardial sac or membrane. And you have a parietal portion and a visceral portion. Visceral would be the portion that directly attached to the organ. And that's the heart muscle. Now that we have introduction of the components of the blood, the layout of the blood vessels, and the heart itself, we can now look at how blood moves through the circulatory system. Now, if you're seeing the diagram, this is a very good diagram because it shows, you can clearly see the deoxygenated side, which is the right side, and you can clearly see the oxygenated side, which is the left side. Now we're going to start on the right side, right? You can learn it from any chamber. So you can learn the circulation of blood from any chamber of the heart. I just choose to do it from the right side. All right, now blood, deoxygenated blood from the upper portion and lower portion of the body is going to travel via the superior and inferior vena cava, and that deoxygenated blood is going to enter the right atrium of the heart. The right atrium of the heart then contracts and pushes that deoxygenated blood into the right ventricle. So it passes through this valve right here, which is a tricuspid valve, and it goes into the right ventricle. When the deoxygenated blood reaches the right ventricle, the right ventricle then contracts and pumps that blood into the pulmonary artery. So it passes through the pulmonic valve and goes into the pulmonary artery, which splits into two. One goes to the right lung and one goes to the left lung. Now, when that deoxygenated blood is traveling via the pulmonary arteries will break down into pulmonary arterioles. The pulmonary arterioles then become pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary capillaries in the lungs are wrapped around the alveoli. Now, at the point that this deoxygenated blood reaches the pulmonary capillaries, the individual takes a breath and air gets down to the alveoli that has a high concentration of oxygen. So the oxygen leaves the alveoli, goes into the blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and then CO2 leaves the pulmonary capillaries and goes into the alveoli, and we exhale that. Now the blood is oxygenated. So we're now on the oxygenated side of the pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary capillaries will eventually form what we call the pulmonary venules. The pulmonary venules will become pulmonary veins, and you have 4 pulmonary veins, 2 coming from the right lung, 2 coming from the left. The pulmonary veins will transport oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The left atrium then contracts and pushes that oxygenated blood into the left ventricle, and it passes through a valve here. So it passes through the bicuspid or mitral valve and enter the left ventricle. The left ventricle then contracts and push the blood up into the aorta. It passes through the aortic valve closes, the coronary artery fills with blood and feeds the heart. Then the aorta will branch into the ascending and descending aorta. The ascending will transport oxygenated blood to the upper portion of the body. The descending will transport oxygenated blood to the lower portion of the body. This blood will eventually reach the systems in these areas, and then the tissues in these areas, and then the cells in these areas. Now, the aorta will break down into arteries, systemic arteries, and then we get systemic arterioles, and then we get systemic capillaries. The systemic capillaries form a net over the tissue cells. So it's right over the tissue cells. So what happens at that point is oxygen leaves the systemic capillaries and goes into the cell. So the cell is able to pick up that oxygen and then give off CO2. So CO2 is then transferred to the systemic capillaries. So the blood is no longer oxygenated, it becomes deoxygenated again. Now, on the deoxygenated side of the systemic capillaries, The systemic capillaries will form the systemic venules. Then the systemic venules will form the systemic veins. Then the systemic veins will form the inferior and superior vena cava. And then the deoxygenated blood starts again on the right side. So the process repeats itself. So it's a closed network in terms of how the blood circulates. Did I lose anybody? Are there any questions on that? All right. I just said a whole lot. So let's see if you understood anything I just said. Go ahead, Mr. McCoy.
Yes, sir. So the blood basically gets oxygenated in the lungs.
Yes, that's the only place the blood can be oxygenated, nowhere else.
Okay.
Any other question? Okay, anybody want me to go over it again before I ask my question?
Yes, sir, you can go over it again.
All right. Okay. All right, so let's go again. All right, so remember yesterday I said that if we don't understand how the vessels break down, it can be confusing. So it is important that you understand that the vena cava breaks down into veins, then it breaks down into venules, then it breaks down into capillaries. And then it connects to the arterioles, which becomes arteries, the aorta, right? So you make sure you understand that fundamental concept. Now, starting on the right side, right? The right side is the dirty side. I always start on the dirty side. It's not a must. So you can learn it on the left side. You can learn it from the chambers of the heart, wherever you're comfortable. But I learned it from the right side, the dirty side. So we have the vena cava, which is the largest veins in the body. You have the superior vena cava and you have the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava collects deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body, and the inferior vena cava transports deoxygenated blood, I should be saying, deoxygenated blood from the lower portion of the body. So, deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body and the lower portion of the body is going to travel via the superior and the inferior vena cava, and then it empties into the right atrium. The right atrium then contracts and pushes this deoxygenated blood through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle then contracts and pumps the deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary arteries. So it passes through the pulmonic valve, which closes, and then it goes into the pulmonary artery, which bifurcates or splits, and you have one pulmonary artery going to the right lung and one going to the left lung. The pulmonary arteries will transport deoxygenated blood. The pulmonary arteries will eventually break down to pulmonary arterioles. Then the pulmonary arterioles will become pulmonary capillaries. The pulmonary capillaries in the lungs are wrapped closely around the alveoli. At the point that the deoxygenated blood reaches the alveoli in the pulmonary capillaries, air is coming into the alveoli. And that air will have a high concentration of oxygen. So that oxygen will now diffuse from the alveoli into the pulmonary capillaries, and the CO2 will diffuse from the blood in the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli, and then it is exhaled. Now the blood is oxygenated. Now on the oxygenated side of the pulmonary capillaries, it will eventually form pulmonary venules. Then excuse me, one sec. Then the pulmonary venules will eventually become pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins will now transport the oxygenated blood, and there are 4 pulmonary veins, 2 coming from the right lung, 2 coming from the left lung. So the pulmonary veins will now transport the oxygenated blood to the left atrium. The left atrium then contracts, pushes that blood through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then contract and pump that oxygenated blood into the aorta. It passes through the aortic valve, it closes, the coronary arteries then fill with blood and supply the heart muscle. Then the aorta will split. It's going to split to form the ascending and descending aorta. The ascending aorta will transport oxygenated blood to the upper portion of the body. The descending aorta will transport oxygenated blood to the lower portion of the body. The aorta eventually breaks down into systemic arteries, which breaks down into systemic arterioles, which breaks down into systemic capillaries. The systemic capillaries are closely wrapped around the tissue cells. The tissue cells will then give up the CO2 and pick up the oxygen. So the tissue cells have a high concentration of CO2 than oxygen. So the CO2 is going to move into the blood and oxygen moves out of the systemic capillaries and oxygenate the tissue cells. Now the blood in the systemic capillaries is deoxygenated. The systemic capillaries on the deoxygenated side will become systemic venules. These systemic venules will form systemic veins, and the systemic veins will eventually merge into the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava, and the process begins again. That is the circulation of blood within the heart. Now, let's see if what I said up to this point is being processed properly, right? Because I've said a lot. So let's see if you understood what I said. All right. So I'm going to ask a question. It is a circulation question. So let me just put that out here. It is a circulation question. Now listen carefully. If, let me zoom in a little bit on my end. If the right ventricle, so if the right ventricle is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood and pumping that deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary arteries to the lungs, right? So that's the function of the right ventricle. If the right ventricle is damaged, so if it's damaged and it can no longer carry out that function effectively, what is going to happen? So let me repeat. The right ventricle is responsible for receiving and distributing deoxygenated blood to the lungs. It is damaged. So the patient have a heart attack and it's damaged. It can no longer carry out that function effectively. What is going to happen? Go ahead, Mr. Graham.
Yes, good morning again, sir. Good morning, class. Well, if the right ventricle, as I said, is unable to pump the deoxygenated blood to the lungs to get oxygenated, that means the body will have an overflow of carbon dioxide in the system, and that will most likely result in system shutting down. Right?
All right. So again, Mr. Graham, it is a circulation question. Didn't ask you anything about oxygenation. It's a circulation question. So we're looking at what is going to happen immediately, not long-term effects. So you're not incorrect, but you're not answering what I'm asking. All right, anybody else? Come on, people. Don't let me have to pick. Go ahead, Miss Roxburgh.
Yes, sir. I'd just like for you to repeat the question once more.
Okay. The right ventricle of the heart is responsible for receiving deoxygenated blood and pumping that blood to the lungs to be oxygenated. It is damaged, so it can no longer do that task effectively. What do you think is going to happen? And it's a circulation question.
Yes, sir. Morning again. I think there will be.
Hold on. I'm talking to Miss Roxburgh. So, Miss Roxburgh, go ahead. Where's Miss Roxburgh?
I'm still here, sir. I'm just thinking. So, if the right ventricle is no longer able to perform its function, which is to getting deoxygenated blood to both lungs, well, basically the circulation would stop. It would honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
I hear you. Next person. Who was the person that was speaking prior to?
Moran, sir.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I think there will be only oxygenated blood would be circulating in the system.
You think there would be only oxygenated blood circulating?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
I hear you. Miss Kerr, go ahead.
Hi, morning, sir. All right. So,
Morning.
in my opinion, I think that the fact that the right atrium would contract and push the deoxygenated blood to the right ventricle. In that event, if there's an overflow of deoxygenated blood coming from the both inferior and superior vena cava, then into the right atrium, then it's going to cause a problem. So there's going to be a breakdown on the complete right side of the heart.
Okay.
So due to the
I
fact,
like your thought process. I like your thought process. So your reasoning is logical. I like that. Not going to tell you if you're right or wrong though. I just like how you're processing the information. Mr. Duhini, go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. If the right atrium and ventricle isn't performing its job, say it is shut, the person would go into a cardiac arrest because there would be no flow of blood flow would stop because both side of the heart, both the deoxygenated side and oxygenated side, blood has to be constantly flowing for both sides to function. Now, if one side isn't functioning properly, the person would go into cardiac arrest unless somebody can actually manually pump that side or to start the flow until whatever interrupt that flow in the first place is fixed. But the person would go into cardiac arrest and um oxygen wouldn't eventually enter into the bloodstream because, as I said, the flow would stop. So in the alveoli, there would be no exchange of CO2 and O2 gases.
Okay. All right. So again, when you're asked a question, listen to what the question is asking. First thing I said is a circulation question. All right, it's a circulation question. At no point in the question I said the heart stopped. At no point I said that. I said the right ventricle is not able to do its job effectively. That's what I said. I didn't say the right ventricle stopped working or the heart stopped. All right. Mr. Scarlett, go ahead.
Morning, everyone.
Mhm.
I'm saying if the deoxygenated blood cannot pump from the right ventricle up, will there be an increase in pressure on that side of the heart?
Okay, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. All right, I hear you, Mr. Scarlett. I hear you. Mr. Jones, and this will be the last person that I take. Go ahead, Mr. Jones.
My view from all of this, if the right ventricle isn't functioning efficiently, I think that will put additional strain and pressure on the right atrium to be exerting additional force to continue the flow or to try to compensate for the lacking efficiency of the right ventricle.
All right, I hear you. Okay, keep that hand down. All right, so let's break it down. So I've heard all the comments or answers. Some persons were not able to process it. Some persons are overthinking. Some persons were focusing on the gas exchange, and some persons were focusing on the circulation. Now, the question I just asked you is a pathophysiology question. And when you have a patient in the field, this is how they will present, right? They're not going to present with normal functions. and need EMS. So if nothing is wrong with them, they're not gonna call EMS unless they just want a night at the hospital, right? So something is gonna be wrong with the system, and that is the abnormal function. So let's break it down. The right ventricle, so the right ventricle is damaged. So this patient has a heart attack. The right ventricle is no longer able to work effectively, and its main function is to receive deoxygenated blood and pump that blood via the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. So what it means is that if it's damaged, it will not be able to pump the blood that it is receiving fast enough, right? It doesn't mean that it can't push that blood to the lungs. It just means that it's not doing it adequately. Now, if the right ventricle is not pushing out blood faster than it is receiving that blood, what you're gonna have is a back pressure being created. So you're gonna get a back pressure being created in the right ventricle. That back pressure will eventually go up and affect the valves. So it's going to put pressure on the valves, and then the valves cannot close properly, right? And then that back pressure will end up in the right atrium. Then that back pressure is going to end up in the superior and inferior vena cava. So the patient's neck veins start to pop up. You start to see distended neck veins. As the pressure builds up in the inferior vena cava, the liver starts to enlarge, the lower extremity starts to collect fluid, right? Edema. Plasma starts to leak out. So they get swollen legs. So this would be a patient that is presenting in what we call right side heart failure. So the right side of the heart is failing. Now, anytime the ventricles, whether it's right or left, is damaged and it cannot function effectively, you will get a back pressure being created where the blood is coming from. Let me repeat that. Anytime the ventricles are damaged and not working effectively, you will get a back pressure created where the blood is coming from. Now, with that understanding, this is my next question. If the left ventricle is damaged from a heart attack, and the left ventricle is responsible for receiving oxygenated blood from the left atrium, which is coming from the lungs, right? And then distributing that blood via the aorta to the upper and lower portion of the body. If it's damaged, where is the back pressure going to end up? Go ahead, Ms. Kerr.
The back pressure, sir, is going to end up back into the lungs.
Good. Everybody agree with that? Anybody have any different concept in their head? So that's where the back pressure is going to end up, right? So the left ventricle is damaged, can no longer push that blood fast enough into the aorta. So a back pressure is created, puts pressure on the valve, put pressure on the left atrium, and then a back pressure is created. So blood is flowing from the lungs, and a back pressure is being pushed towards that blood that is coming out. So what is going to happen is the plasma will start to leak out in the alveoli, and the patient start to develop fluid in the lungs, pulmonary edema. That is a patient in left side heart failure. Right now, every group I ask this question, right? Every group that I've trained over the years, I've asked this question, and the purpose of this question is, so the purpose of this question is to determine if you have a strong understanding of the anatomy and physiology. And this is what I always say to students. When you're studying anatomy and physiology, if you cannot reverse it, so if you cannot reverse the anatomy and physiology, you don't know it, right? So if you can't reverse the anatomy and physiology, you don't know it well enough. And that must be your goal. So when you study the normal function of a system, reverse it, right? So ask yourself the question, if this system is not able to do this, what is going to happen, right? So if it's respiratory, if ventilation is the mechanical action of breathing in and out, if this patient cannot breathe in and out, what would happen? So you need to learn to reverse the anatomy and physiology. Once you can reverse it, you know it and you'll never forget it. All right, now that is the circulatory system in terms of blood flow. Let me zoom out. All right, best fit. All right, so let's take a break before you get brain overload. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break. We will resume at 9:20, and then we continue.